thank you all for coming. This is going to be a very lively debate, I can tell. So thanks for coming to Misinformation Wars. Who facts the fact checkers? A really important debate with the news currently about what is misinformation to do with the war in Israel and Gaza. I'm Tessa Clarke, an author on free speech books and campaigner on free speech, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this debate. When I first began as a journalist, it was part of the job to check your facts. Now, apparently, it's just the job of the disinformation reporter to check my facts for me and tell me what's wrong. And that is quite a sea change, I think, in all these labels about who should check who and why and who's in authority to do with the truth. And I'm very pleased to introduce my speakers today. On my left, Andrew Lowenthal, who's a writer and founder of liber-net, and who's building a global movement of digital rights supporters on free speech. And on my right, Deacon, who's the communications and campaigns consultant at Pagefield Communications consultancy. And on my far left, it's Florence Read. I'm very pleased to welcome her, who's a writer and presenter for UnHerd TV, a cross-party commentary online magazine, UnHerd. Their full biographies are online, so we're going to get straight to their introductions for 4 minutes each, and then it's straight out to you. I want all your points, all your questions. Let's make this debate the liveliest one yet. So first, Andrew.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's quite the challenge. But again, thank you everyone for turning up. I guess it is also technically 11, which is very, very helpful. Glad we made that collective illusion possible. So yeah, my name is Andrew Lowenthal. The things I want to talk about, or I will talk about today, is I worked on the Twitter files with Matt Taibbi. And so that was highly revelatory, both to myself, but also in terms of the things that we discovered and around this disinformation or the censorship industrial complex, as Michael Schellenberger came to name it, and also the work that I've been doing around something called the Westminster Declaration, which hopefully some people have heard of, and I think there's probably a few signatories in here as well. That is a kind of new free speech declaration that came out about 10 days or so ago, I believe. So really for me, what the Twitter files showed was that these hunches, that there was some highly coordinated system of censorship turned out to be true. I worked on Twitter files with Matt Taibbi around the Global Engagement Center, a massively funded US government initiative that gives a lot of money to academics and NGOs and various other enterprises. Something around the Virality Project, which was a project to combat anti-vaccine misinformation. Twitter files around Australia and the way that very kind of accounts as small as 20 followers were being censored for so-called misinformation, which often turned out to be true, and then around RFK Jr. as well, and various specific targeting of him. Again, because we only have 4 minutes, and I've probably used up half my time already, the key takeaways for us, and we did this map that some people may have seen, called, which was named the Censorship Industrial Complex, which looked at all of the different players in the government agencies, the huge philanthropies that were funding this, the intelligence community, the big tech companies, academics, and NGOs. My background is in the NGO sector and in various parts of academia, so I was extremely, well, I had a hunch, and this is how I ended up connecting with Matt Taibbi to do this work, is because I actually worked in the NGO space, including on some aspects of anti-disinformation, but particularly looking at online freedom of expression in Asia, which is where my former NGO worked. So I had an inkling that something was going wrong, particularly around COVID, that the information space, as much as it used to be manipulated, something else had happened. Something new was going on that essentially had evolved, let's say, the Iraq war model of public opinion management had transmogrified into something much more elaborate, much more sophisticated, and much more difficult to get one's head around in terms of what was going on. I think people now, the kind of mimetic change has happened where people are starting to understand that there's something quite, there's this kind of space of kind of interchange and coordination going on between these agencies. It's not a conspiracy theory, unfortunately. It's actually worse than that. There's huge amounts of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. In some cases, there are Pentagon-funded, Pentagon contracts that would go to kind of DC Beltway enterprises for almost $1 billion. This is huge, huge amounts of money that is going into this enterprise, and it needs to essentially be exposed. And I think that's a lot of what the Twitter files and other things have done. Just quickly on the Westminster Declaration, that is this new free speech statement that has been signed by a whole number of luminaries: Assange, Snowden, Greenwald, Jordan Peterson, Steven Pinker, Slavoj Žižek, Jean Cleese, etc. Do check it out, westminsterdeclaration.org. That is essentially the kind of positive statement or the positive movement towards trying to bring some more accountability and catalyze a new movement for free speech.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Flo.
Golly, okay. Thank you all for coming out so early. I'm really feeling the time. It's a tough question, misinformation, and one that I'm afraid I cannot provide any answers for. At UnHerd, our mentality is to try and represent as many views and as much of a breadth of information as we can so that people can make up their own minds about what they think about these big questions. And I think that is perhaps the best remedy we've found so far. So instead of trying to give you answers, I'm going to be really annoying and try to give you some provocations or questions that perhaps we can think about as we go along. The first is what exactly it means to be someone who is scouring the internet for misinformation. I would say that information and ethics have become interchangeable in many people's minds. And so the people who are self-styled misinformation experts have become a kind of modern morality police. They have conflated the idea of true and false with right and wrong. I think in turn, for many, that has become something of kind of cognitive confusion. Cognitive chaos has abounded in the last few years, which is why I think we consider ourselves as being in a kind of post-truth era. I think in many ways we're also in a post-morality era because truth and morality have become so bound up. So instead of breeding skeptics, which is at UnHerd what we try to do, and I think at Battle of Ideas as well is a shared goal, we have bred people who are either ideologues or black-pilled nihilists with no trust at all in the people who serve us information about the world we live in. This is a very dire situation to be in because what you're getting is the two extremes, the two poles, without anything in the middle. And unfortunately, it does seem to be that the people in the middle do tend to be the ones who come up with the best ideas and can balance the extremes. We seem to have lost those people in recent years. The alternative media, of which I am, of course, a part, does have a lot to answer for. We cannot get off scot-free. It's easy to bash the BBC or the New York Times, but the alternative media has played its part in the last few years in sowing a level of distrust and creating this kind of low-trust society. I think we can do a lot better. Citizen journalism as well has added to the confusion. Now everyone has in their pockets something that they can lift up and document the world around them. Documenting the world around you does not mean you're on a highway to truth. In fact, all it really means is that you can see things from a ground perspective, but perspectives can be warped, as we saw over the last few years when it came to Black Lives Matter, COVID, so many examples, which I'm sure we'll get into. So social media also has a part to play as the public square. A question I would ask, I suppose, is, does it matter who's in charge of the public square? Should there be one person in charge? In this case, I suppose Elon Musk is that figure. Is he a destabilizing force, or is he bringing a new era of citizen truth to the fore? The other thing I'd like to ask is, if we gesture into the future, how will artificial intelligence and automation play into this question? We saw during the pandemic, Facebook, platforms like Facebook, or Meta as it's now known, using algorithms to sift out what they considered misinformation. That, of course, led to what can only be described as perhaps one of the greatest experiments in a low-trust society, global society, that we've ever done. And I think coming out of COVID, we are finding that people have the lowest levels of trust perhaps ever before in the medical establishment. Now, why is that? Well, quite possibly because of the work of these algorithms. Algorithms, of course, must be designed by a person. They come with all of the same ideological problems as we do as human beings. Can they be rid of those ideological problems is another question entirely. Finally, I suppose, and this might be truly a controversial thing to say in this room, but is truth really that important? If we return to our small tribes where we live by shared myths, as we used to in a pre-internet age, small communities, small villages, gathered around a church, community, or whatever else, then can we use a kind of fog of fictions to cope with the real world and escape this kind of post-truth nihilism that social media seems to have dragged us into? I'm sorry, that's quite a depressing way to end, but that's how I...
Thank you, Flo. Liam.
Hi. My answer, I did map out sort of three sort of smart-ass points about satire and conspiracy and how truth emerges from discussion, but my background is tabloid journalism, really awful tabloid journalism, and also in politics. So I thought I'd just tell a couple of stories, anecdotes that sort of bring this to life. And my answer to the question, who fact-checks the fact-checkers, is the reader and other journalists, because in my view, fact-checkers are just other journalists. There shouldn't be any special category of fact-checker journalists bestowed with sort of extra credibility and crucially charitable status, and the tax breaks that brings. They are just journalists. So let me just tell a couple of stories about this. When I was running the press desk for the Brexit Party in the heat of the 2019 general election, BuzzFeed were a pain in my arse. I got lots of emails of BuzzFeed. They were digging up tweets from, one of the many 600 candidates that we had. Some were better than others, and constantly just throwing me firebombs. And they were doing journalism. They were very ideological. They were very atrocious. But fair enough. They were holding us to account. In about towards the end of 2019, they started winding down operations. Obviously, the general election, end of 2019. I think it was I checked online, it was about May 2020, they sacked their entire politics team and they sort of shut up doors. And I remember I was running the press desk in the post-general election period. And it was I noticed getting few and few emails from BuzzFeed and more emails from an organisation called Full Fact UK. And I remember checking the website of Full Fact UK, and there was 3 or 4 BuzzFeed journalists in their sort of roster of fact-checkers. And I just remember how egregious it felt, how frustrating, that they were the same idiots doing the same thing, but they'd sort of cloaked themselves in this new gown of impartiality, and they were getting tax breaks for doing the exact same thing. And it just sort of really brought that to life. And it, of course, this new gown of impartiality that they wore gave them, it made them impervious to our criticisms that they were ideological, and made it very difficult for us to criticise them. So I just think that's an interesting thing. As it happens, I checked the website of Full Fact before doing this. It's exactly the same. Their head of press now is former Hope Not Hate, BBC, Mirror. I'm casting aspersions on them, and I have nothing against a group of people getting together and doing journalism from their perspective. And I do think some of them are bloody good at what they do, but we should see them for what they are. They're just journalists. And I think it's a very interesting question. I want the audience perhaps to answer this. Why is there no right-wing fact-checkers, or certainly people on the right that are perceived in this way? I think it's something to do with a paternalism and elitism on the left, that they see the masses are being we're perpetually misled by hate and billionaires that run the papers, and they need to correct our thinking constantly. But it's an open question. Second story, and I'll jump a bit there. And this one is truly egregious. I tell it because it's funny, but it's egregious and it should shock you, and I hope it does. I was doing some shifts at the Daily Star, maybe 2018. Great newspaper. I genuinely believe that. I mean, you're all laughing, but it engages people. People pick up that paper and they enjoy it. I certainly do, but maybe this says something about me, not journalism. But I was at the Daily Star, and I was on the weekend team, and one of the night editors was the editor that weekend. Only 3 of us running the entire website for the weekend. And it was just after Soleimani had been killed by the Americans. And we had this... but the point of this story, by the way, is it illustrates how rushed modern journalists are, how desperate they are for clicks, how much pressure they're under, and how they struggle with the new tools and the new reality at their fingers, okay? And this is a point about poor journalism. It's not about misinformation. I think this really is part of the problem. So Soleimani had just been shot or assassinated, and there we are, 22nd floor of Canada Square 1 in Canary Wharf, and we had this new tool called Data Miner, and the editor had flagged it's great. We're gonna get loads of clicks for this. It finds things that are about to go viral. And the state of the online tabloids was such that about 50% of our clicks just came from rewriting things that had already gone viral on social media. I'm sure you've seen these stories. So it picked up this tweet that was in Arabic, and it was going viral, that the Iranians had launched a missile, right? And the night editor runs this story, Arabic reports of missiles launched. And I remember thinking, fucking hell, we could start World War III here. Like, if the Iranians really have just launched a missile, the Americans are going to respond. Things are going to go AWOL really quick. It quite quickly became clear that this one random Arabic tweet was complete tosh. And I remember saying to my editor, like, we should escalate this. We should issue an apology. We should do something. Like, this is terrible. Like, this is not just a minor mistake. This is really egregious stuff. In the end, he just tweaked the headline to something like, fears of missile strike grow in Middle East as Twitter reports, or something ridiculous. But the point I'm trying to make is that online journalism is under a lot of pressure, a lot of financial pressure. Fact-checking needs to be done within journalistic organisations, and there is a lot of poor journalism going on. But it is also true to say that I slightly disagree with the other speakers here, we don't live in an era uniquely besotted by misinformation. This isn't the golden age of misinformation. There is poor journalism happening, but it always has happening, and misinformation has always spread. We need better journalism, we need better investment in journalism, we need to think about what online journalism means in a social media era. And these terrible things keep happening, but fact-checkers aren't going to change it because they're just the same as us.
Thank you. Let's give a big round of applause for our speakers. So there has been a huge growth in, fact-checkers, whether they're journalists calling themselves the official fact-checkers or government agencies, and all the private companies that Andrew was talking about, and the things that Flo were talking about as well in terms of how do we combat it. So now it's over to you. I normally would ask loads of questions, but it's actually over to you. I want loads of questions, loads of points. I'll take 4 or 5 and then bring the speakers back, and then 4 or 5 again.
There is actually one right-of-centre fact-checker that I can think of called factsforeu.org.uk.
I know them well.
Yeah. The other question I'd ask is it's slightly tangential, but I'm very concerned about memory holding of scientific papers and medical papers, particularly during the COVID pandemic era. A lot of scientific papers have been started to disappear from the internet, and I'm wondering if the panel have got any comments on that.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Just to pick up from what the gentleman on my left was saying a minute ago, and on what you were saying about a lot of fact-checking being just rushed journalism. I hope I'm interpreting you correctly there. I think it's more insidious than that. Talking about the COVID era and now, through to now, and not looking to get any better. There are a lot of very, very respectable, on the face of it, very respectable scientists, thousands of them, in fact, all over the world, who have been literally blocked from publishing papers, which are important ones, and all they want is for those to be debated in the public and the scientific arena. And one of the instruments around all that suppression is the so-called fact checkers, who, in effect, they act as a kind of a barricade for, you know, the busy but inquiring person who wants to look into this. They see a fact checker that says, "Oh, Peter McCulloch in the States is obviously a complete nutcase." That very, very carefully crafted. Everywhere on the fact checkers, very carefully crafted assassinations or vilifications of Peter McCulloch. I'll just give him as an example. There are plenty more. So it's not just bad journalism. There is actually an agenda there to silence certain messages, and COVID is not the only one. And similar things exist about Ukraine and about the current situation in Israel. That really is what I would say. It's much more concerted than just rush journalism. There is a very powerful agenda there.
Yeah, thank you all very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who was co-opted onto a Foreign Office-funded team working on combating hybrid warfare with a particular emphasis on misinformation. We were hacked by the Russians, and my colleagues got calls from Russian stooges, rather threatening ones. I was never under any pressure from the program to toe a particular line. I was covering the links between state-protected organized crime and Russian and Chinese geopolitical aims. There's a lot of that. I'm a strong admirer of UnHerd. My question is about a complicating factor, which how you see this can be tackled. Misinformation and disinformation by omission. In other words, what is not being said about things that are very much in the public domain. One example I would give is whether or not the Iranians had a role in the Lockerbie bombing. Clearly at the time, many people thought they did because of the shooting down of the Iranian airliner by the USS Vincennes. I have heard a prominent academic give wholly false information about that incident, and in any case, you can't understand the actions of the Vincennes crew without understanding what happened to the Stark.
Just that, to go back to the first question, I'm very interested in the way in which online versus print media has changed the way in which we deal with issues of truth and misinformation. Scientific papers being a good example. Online scientific journals, Nature being one example, now do have the ability to disappear information in ways that they never quite could before. And it's the same with newspapers. When there used to be print records of everything, someone's grandmother would have taken a clipping from a newspaper and kept it in a book, like my grandmother used to, with every single news article that mentioned my father. And that record was in some way uncontroversial, or you actually couldn't deny that you'd said something. Whereas now, online journalists can do something which is called in journalists speak kind of fixing the back end, which sounds a little euphemistic, but it's not. It just means kind of going into the online infrastructure and changing what you say. This means that across COVID, people could avoid apologizing because they could simply enter into the back end and avoid being held to account by either disappearing their own information or editing it to reflect whatever the current new truth was. So it's very difficult to hold people to account when we are working in this online space where everything can be live edited. And so in many ways, it might be a good reason to maintain some degree of print media. And then the man who was from the security service, I thought was a really interesting question about omission. I think the other thing we might want to think about here is suppression. What's worse, to be shown misinformation or not to be shown information? I think that's genuinely a question we have to deal with. If we're not allowed to see the truth, then does that actually impoverish us even more than being shown many biased truths or truths?
Thank you. Lynn, would you be willing to show your vested interest in every article?
No. I'll tell you why. I've also worked for some think tanks on Tufton Street, done a little bit of work with them. And there's no reason why journalists are humans like other people. We all have vested interests. You know, I live in the countryside. I have a child. These kind of things drive my interest, drive my priorities. And I think it's quite insulting to think that right-wing think tanks are completely puppets of their funders. And when you publish all your funding, you open yourselves up to an incredible amount of tax and vitriol. I've been in an office that has had a door smashed in by Just Stop Oil, I think they were at that point, or Extinction Rail, I can't fucking remember. It's all on YouTube, if you want to see my terrified face sat by the door. But no, absolutely not. I've worked with some fine, impartial think tankers, and they don't publish who funds them, and that's great. To take to the other points, rush journalism. I hear what you're saying, and I didn't mean to trivialise, right, the general discussion that we're having. I was trying to be a bit jovial, lift the mood a bit. It does go a lot deeper than rush journalism, but I do think that is a big part of what's perceived. One of the weird side effects of online journalism is that every journalist can read every other journalist's stories and not only read them, but critique them and grandstand about them and join a thread when they all talk about it. And there's nothing that journalists like to do more than grandstand and tickle their own egos. And I do think that's what drives a lot of it. They see other poorly written stories and they convince themselves we're living in this golden age of misinformation when we're just not. In the French Revolution, the masses convinced themselves that the aristocracies were killing babies. You know, in the 90s there was a vaccine, misinformation scandal, and the internet was only just taking off. You know, anti-Semitic pogroms were all driven by waves of misinformation. It's always happened. And actually, when you look at it, the internet allows us to correct sort of waves of misinformation far quicker than we could have pre-internet. I don't think this is the acute problem that we think it is today. It's just that we read about it. I just want to quickly. The impartiality point about what's being missed off, what's being omitted, is a very important point. I think that's actually a point about impartiality than it is about misinformation. The BBC always say they're impartial, but you can't be impartial when you have a homepage, because the story that you choose to make your lead story that day, be that a flood in Malaysia or that a report on the gender pay gap, two really important stories, but the story that you choose to make your leading story that day says something about the way that you view the world. It says something about your values, and you omit the other one. So impartiality is the problem there, not misinformation. They're both valid bits of information, but that's a problem about impartiality, which is a whole other discussion.
Thank you. Andrew.
Cool, thanks. I think to the question of who's funding think tanks, NGOs, academic institutes is actually extremely important, because not necessarily because every funder has a nefarious agenda, but because every funder has their own particular interests, and it will tell you, things that are important about the information that you're receiving that you should kind of use as a filter and understanding. In terms of thinking about this, the massive amount of funding that has been flooded into this kind of NGO and academic sector and other spaces to police misinformation, though there's particular funders, there's Craig Newmark, there's EngageMedia, there's the Knight Foundation, actually were the biggest ones that we found when we did this mapping project, but several others, and they all have their particular agendas that they want to see play out, and narratives that they would prefer to see suppressed, etc. So I think that part is actually hugely important, and actually that was one of the main points of doing this work in this research. In terms of the level of, it also goes back to the other comment that someone made about how kind of targeted is this? Is it just people making mistakes? So one particularly important project is something called the Virality Project. It's one of the projects that's so-called in the dock, I guess, in terms of the Missouri versus Biden suit, which is now going up to the Supreme Court in the US. And they were doing this work around policing so-called misinformation of anti-vaccine misinformation. They literally, in their communications with Twitter, said that that people should consider true stories of vaccine side effects as standard misinformation. So truth became misinformation if it essentially drifted from the approved ideas or that those funders or those public health agencies wanted the public to receive. And it goes to why has there been a collapse in trust of public health. Actually, not lying is a great way to lose people. Well, lying, sorry, is a great way to lose trust. Giving people complex information where there's risks and benefits to something is going to get you a kind of longer term, much better societal outcome. I can see you trying to stop me and move back to questions. Go for it.
Thank you. Out there. Right. Very, very quickly, and then I can get everyone in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I went through the start of COVID and looking at what was presented. For example, the BBC, and I started doing some research, and then you got to the Trusted News Initiative, and then I looked at things like Reuters, which used to be reputable and so on, and you found the funding of people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, George Soros, the Clinton Foundation, damaging things like the Great Barrington Declaration, even the Telegraph. You've got the global security bit funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he said 2010 was going to be the decade of vaccines. And so many people don't know this because the BBC, when I was young, and I used to see Gorbachev on it and saying how trusted it was. So we've got a layer of people like me who have this idea, but most of my friends think, oh, the BBC, they must be impartial. But, I don't think it is. And I don't know how to reach my friends to say, investigate, here is what I've found.
Thank you very much.
Hi. Would it improve things enormously on the internet if we had to pay for the content? So moving away from a clickbait advertising model to paying to actually read things, including accessing Google.
Thank you.
Just going back to the issue of, the issue of the AI. So we mentioned, AI has been used in terms of filtering, but now we are moving towards AI being used as a content generator. So in your example, the Twitter in the Iranian, bombing, there could be a video showing the Iranian bombing. So all of us as a mobile, all of us can plug into this platform, SaaS, and we'll all generate this content. So in this context, policing became almost impossible. What's your view where we're going? And maybe, some of the solution can be pay, but also auto-certification or other way of thinking about the issue.
Thank you. My question's related to the last one, I guess. The comments today have really focused principally on print media, although there have been references to television and the like as well. We're probably about to see the rise, and we may already be seeing it in the context of the Gazan war, I don't know, of deep fake videos. And I want the panel to imagine the following scenario, that the video clips of the hospital bombing in Gaza had been preceded by a deep fake video of Netanyahu saying something like, bomb the Arab hospital. Imagine the galvanizing effect of this, because what we see, I think, is much more likely to induce an entirely visceral reaction than what we read.
Thank you.
In the same vein, there are publications operating in the UK, like Five Pillars, for example, who haven't cited the Hamas atrocities as the inciting incident in the outbreak of violence at all. They didn't cover any of the repression of women and girls in Iran, any of the killings, 400 killings by the Islamic Republic during the protests about the Marsamini tragedy. And then they are invited onto Newsnight and billed as a website popular with Sunni Muslims, when to any outside observer, it looks like an Islamist propaganda sheet. So should they be invited, treated as valid interlocutors?
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to that gentleman about his point regarding deepfakes. Really appreciate it. I want to go to Liam's point that we're not living in the golden age of disinformation, because it seems to me that the examples that you gave comes from a time where we did have a shared epistemology, but today we don't even have a shared ontology. I'll give you one example. 20, 30 years ago, Alex Jones would have been someone who would be standing outside a tube station selling pens from a paper cup. Today, he's got over 10 million followers on his various channels. So, which brings me to the final point I make, and this might cause me to be assaulted by people here, but please forgive me.
Talk it out.
Yeah. Is part of this not the fault of ours as opposed to the media, in the sense that we've skewed the incentives for the media to be not right, but be first?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the BBC used to be great science programs. It used to do comedy, Fawlty Towers and news. But now the fact checker Mariana Spring has lied on her CV. And if you look... Sorry? Stand up. Oh, yeah. Now she's lied on her CV. And if you look at BBC reporting on Gaza, they seem to be in league with Hamas. So given they're, in league with Hamas in a certain sense, covering up what they're doing, I predict that the BBC will probably have bombing ratings and some explosive new programming, such as a comedy program called Faulty Rockets, Exploding Falafel Fridays, a cooking show, and after the watershed, the Gaza Stripper Diaries.
Thank you.
Mention has been made that we live in a post-truth society. I think we should strongly reject this notion of post-truth, because it's only playing into the hands of those who want to censor and spread disinformation.
Okay. Thank you. That's enough. Sorry, next. Thank you. Very good point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so, talking about fixing the back end, there's a huge trend in social media of people screenshotting BBC headlines or, other headlines as soon as they come out, and then an hour after publication, were killed by IDF and then have died as a result of. And I was wondering if you think those edits came from the establishment or from the reactions from the public, which seems very backwards. We shouldn't be, doing journalism.
Thank you very much. Lovely.
Yeah, Andrew, just coming to your point, doing the Twitter files, did you find it interesting that story had such a difficult time getting traction, and what does that say?
To the panel think to the view that a good way of making it harder for social media companies to censor is to stop posting content on legacy social media platforms such as Twitter, X, and YouTube, and instead use the Fediverse, PeerTube, Mastodon, and so forth, and make sure you use an ad blocker whenever you look at things on legacy social media to make sure they don't get any revenue.
I'm going to bring the panel back, but after this, let's go for coffee and continue it and get some sandwiches and cake as well.
Okay, deep breath. That was a whirlwind. To this question, yes. The market is important and we shouldn't support these monopolies. And one of the best ways we can keep an adversarial, conversational way going through truth emerges through debate is to keep supporting new platforms. So yes, the key to the point at the back there, the key thing about the Soleimani story is we didn't start World War III, okay? People didn't believe it. The myth that we started, egregiously started, didn't last, okay? And you made a point about video content online, about citizen journalism online. A lot of citizen journalists are a hell of a lot better than people sat in doing actual journalism at the moment. So it's really important. To the gentleman's point in the middle, at the back, the gentleman with the beard, I do agree with you that there is a specific and unique problem around specific types of misinformation that spread online. I'm not denying that. And people that get stuck in these echo chambers and really start to believe in alternative universes about vaccines and all sorts of things, we need to talk about that. But en masse, we are not living in to make a point about en masse, we are not living in a uniquely misled era. Quite the opposite. There's a lot of information around at the moment. Show me the data that shows me that people today in the 21st century are en masse more misled than they are otherwise. To the point about sort of 5 pillars, they represent a community in this country that are here, whether you like it or not. What are you going to do? you know, are you going to take them offline? Where are you going to drive those discussions? So I've had some run-ins with 5 pillars myself. They are vile, but they exist. They speak for people. They have a website. It gets read. I'd rather not see it shut down. That is the point. So to sum up, this gentleman actually ended on a really nice point. We need to keep supporting a diversity of views and a diversity of platforms within which because those platforms are never going to be neutral. Even Twitter now, it's slightly more neutral than it was, but it's never going to be neutral. And that's the best way to keep fact-checking, to make sure there's maximum perspectives, maximum information, and maximum discussion, and truth emerges from debate. So that's sort of where I'll end.
Thank you very much. Flo.
Okay, I'll rattle through these. Fixing the back end, I don't think it kind of comes particularly from the top down. I don't think there's any conspiracy there. I think it's an economic question. There's young interns and people vying to get a job in the newsroom, and all of them are at the whim of the audience. Everyone's quite scared of their audience. Audience capture is actually a nice term for it. I think it's kind of audience fear. And so that's why I think often things get tweaked to reflect public mood. The Great Barrington Declaration, how to reach out to someone who is engrossed in the kind of BBC line of thinking. I think send them the Great Barrington Declaration video. We broke the Great Barrington Declaration at UnHerd, and then send them the most recent results of the correlation between lockdowns and life expectancy in somewhere like Sweden versus somewhere like the US or here in the UK, and they should be able to get a picture that's based entirely on the facts as we have them, and see exactly what the BBC wasn't telling them at the time. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, I was with a few weeks ago in Stamford, where he teaches. He is still effectively treated like a dissident there, which seems extraordinary given the things that we know to be true now. AI and deepfakes, very, very interesting, and I don't have enough time to really get into it. But I do think, on that note, that mistrust in general and a low-trust society has actually led to people being more susceptible to propaganda. I think it's got this kind of strange inverse correlation with people's hunger for clear information. And the problem is when you're desperate for clear information, propaganda is very easy to imbibe because that's exactly what it offers you. So what we need to do is encourage people to be skeptical, not nihilistic, but skeptical. Finally, the idea of a shared epistemology I think is fascinating, and it comes down to the heart of exactly why I'm interested in this question. We have suffered a terrible philosophical collapse in the West, I think due to a kind of decadent mindset that's allowed us to stray from the shared epistemology, shared ontology that we used to have. I think if we can kind of return to a conversation about that core common philosophy, then we might be able to start moving forward.
Thank you so much. And Andrew.
Great. So I'll try and answer 2 of the questions or comments together, which was around why there was some either pushback or lack of traction around the Twitter files. And one very interesting thing that was discovered around the Hunter Biden laptop was one of the people who was part of, or the organizations that part of the Trusted News Initiative, something called First Draft, that is now the Information Futures Lab at Brown University, participated in something called a election table or tabletop exercise 2 or so months before anyone apart from the FBI and Team Giuliani, the Trump team, knew about the existence of this laptop. So the Aspen Institute pulled together this tabletop. You can read the quotes online that literally say, "Bring your most devious minds," I think is one of the quotes from a guy called Garrett Graff, who's the head of cyber at the Aspen Institute. And at that meeting was the New York Times, was CNN, was First Draft, was Rolling Stone, was NBC, was a whole bunch of media organizations, Twitter and Facebook. How did they know about this laptop when no one else knew about this laptop 2 months before it was released? This anti-misinformation organization, First Draft, who I actually happen to know the director, participated in that. So the people who are meant to be keeping misinformation to account are actually running misinformation operations, one of the most egregious ones that I think we can arguably say impacted an election. Whether or not it would have tipped it, but it certainly, I think you could say, would impact it. So that's a degree in terms of thinking about the corruption that is going on in this space. Quickly on the AI, huge problem. I think we're going to need to start playing around with AI to combat the AI, and I don't know what death spiral we're going to go down. hopefully we come back up for air. Let's see. But the other gentleman's point over here around the Fediverse, I think one of the big problems is that we're kind of scrapping over half a dozen or a dozen platforms, and we need 1,000 different platforms that are much, much more difficult to control, that may have their own different policies. Maybe some are G-rated, PG-rated, some are put everything up, but we're kind of trying to fight over one sandbox, whereas we really need a whole variety of solutions to this problem.
Thank you very much. Let's congratulate the speakers. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Have a good day.